Hi, my name is Myfanwy James. I'm a researcher. I recently finished my PhD at Oxford on MSF's work, and I'm now a research fellow at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, based in London. Yeah, when I set out, I wanted to look at how humanitarians negotiate access in conflict zones, very simply. And I started off as a historian, and I was particularly interested in Eastern DRC, in North Kivu province. And I was a bit surprised to find that MSF didn't already have a study on this because they've worked there for so long. So my main question was, well, how has MSF not just negotiated access to work in a zone with lots of rebel groups, but also maintained that access over a long period of time? So my main finding was really that this was an everyday process of brokerage, interest seeking, perception management, and I really focused on the Congolese staff who have been working there for over a decade, who are absolutely key to this. And my key sort of argument is that during everyday interactions, humanitarians working for MSF try and perform MSF's kind of identity or principles. But sort of paradoxically, I found that everyday markers of difference, like race or gender, nationality or regional identities, interact with personal histories and networks to provide different forms of advantages or risks during those interactions. So I sort of concluded that an industry built on the idea of universal humanity actually leverages markers of difference and identities, the very identities they're sort of trying to transcend through a humanitarian mandate. So methodologically, how do you go about this? I think when you're a researcher at a university and you say you want to do this sort of project, people are a little bit wary because they say, good luck trying to access a humanitarian organisation with a question that might be quite sensitive. And wanting to say, I want an ethnographic approach, I want to go and spend time with people, usually the answer is no. Luckily with MSF, there is the think tank Crash, and they're quite open to sort of research which is independent, but also collaborates with the organisation. And so I got in touch with Crash, I explained the project and the goals, and we had a conversation about what that would look like. My first step was looking at MSF's internal archives in Paris. So I went and had a look at what they already have. I was interested also after 2003 when things had been digitalized. So those were all really fascinating. I looked at SITREPs, I looked at sort of everyday security manuals, but what I thought was missing was the kind of personal stories and also the voices of Congolese staff who are sort of 90% of employees in the region. So after that, I started to get in touch with people who had worked in North Kivu, had lots of experience. And little by little, they sort of suggested other people I should talk to, and it opened up this world. And then I went to North Kivu myself for 9 months, and I spent time with MSF teams in Goma, in Bukavu, and I also went to some of the rural territories in North Kivu. And there I really focused on understanding what MSF's work was, understanding people's experience of working in this area. And I spent a lot of time with Congolese staff trying to understand their experience, their position, and what sort of security management looked like for them. My recent article is based on one of the PhD chapters, and it's a chapter which looks at the experience of humanitarians who are Congolese and also from North Kivu themselves in negotiations for access and in the processes of security management. So in this article, what I wanted to try and do was to look at their role and their experience and how it fits into MSF security management frameworks and protocols more generally. And my basic argument is that these Congolese humanitarians face a bit of a paradox or a tension. Because on the one hand, they're supposed to represent MSF, they're supposed to distance themselves from political networks, armed groups, and this is something they need to do both during work hours and outside work hours, and that's quite explicit. So, but at the same time, those very personal contacts, those very personal histories are a resource for them in their daily work, negotiating access, building contacts, analysing the context. So the same facet, which is their advantage, is also perceived as a risk. And it also poses risks to them. They said that, you know, because my position here is very different from my foreign colleagues, that also exposes me. And it also means that I'm perceived as a bit of a risk in the organisation. So I was interested in that tension and thinking about how we understand the role of local staff, as they're termed, in humanitarianism, in security management. And also I made some conclusions about what that means for thinking about decolonising aid, thinking about who is understood to be neutral and impartial and who is presumed not to be, and tried to think through some of those tricky questions of colonial continuities in humanitarian aid. So in terms of reception, I think it came out in December 2020, which was at the end of this year where people really wanted to talk about this, where people were thinking about inequality, thinking about race in humanitarian aid, as well as lots of other sectors. So it came out at quite a pivotal time, despite the fact that I did the research and wrote it quite a while ago. I think the reception in general was that people were interested. People thought this was a perspective we needed to hear from. I think people were interested in the idea of having an article which drew principally on the voices and experiences of Congolese employees of MSF. I think also it opened up a little bit of a conversation about the links between ideas of neutrality and a more tricky colonial past of mapping the world into, and peoples into, some areas where people are neutral or impartial and some areas where they cannot be. So since I finished my PhD, I started as a research fellow at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. I was in North Kivu in 2018 when the Ebola epidemic started, and I became particularly interested in the vaccine trials which followed. 2 different Ebola vaccine trials followed in North Kivu. So my current role is to explore local experiences of the Ebola epidemic and also the politics surrounding the Johnson & Johnson Ebola vaccine trial, which was rolled out by the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, the INRB in Congo, and also MSF at the start, although Epicentre has now taken over. So I headed back to North Kivu. I've just got back. I was there for another 6 months, where I talked to people about vaccine trials, and I was doing this in the midst of COVID, when this had become quite an explosive topic. So I'm now writing that up and thinking more deeply about how we can understand the contested legitimacy of medical research in Africa.